So, hi everyone. Today I'm going to talk to you about random forest-based mineral potential mapping for porphyry copper gold mineralisation in the eastern Lachlan Orogen, and more specifically in the Macquarie Arc. So I'll first go through the background why we decided to do this study, touch on the geology and mineralisation and the data that we used, and then go into the different mineral potential mapping techniques. So the initial weights of evidence work that was done and why we reanalysed it, the data using random forests, and then what we've actually learned from reanalysing the data. So the background, in 2019, Kennex undertook a collaborative project with the Geological Survey of New South Wales to look at the mineral potential in the East Lachlan Orogen, which was part of a broader statewide mineral potential mapping project that looked at the key mineral systems in the different provinces. And all of this modelling used a weights of evidence approach, which I'll go into more detail in a few slides. So the porphyry model was looking at the Ordovician to early Silurian porphyry copper gold mineralisation associated with fertile magmatic units in the Macquarie Arc. So you can see in this image here, the study area for this modelling was constrained to just the Macquarie Arc, not the whole of the East Lachlan Orogen. And the project was broadly successful, but the mineral potential maps didn't highlight some areas that were expected to come up. That was kind of the focus of reanalysing the data. And so basically, could we learn anything new by reanalysing the data using a different machine learning technique? So what was the best approach to use when setting up the random forest model in terms of the input data? And could we learn anything new about the mineral system and what should be considered its key targeting criteria? And could it produce any new exploration targets that the previous weights of evidence model hadn't shown up? So a list here of the data that were available. All of this came from the Geological Survey and was compiled during the initial collaboration in the first half of 2019. And the review of all the data were undertaken prior to doing the initial weights of evidence modelling. So you can see here the different data types, which of the survey databases that it's come from, and then the amount of data available over the broader East Lachlan Orogen. So as I was saying, the initial study looked at using the weights of evidence technique, which is a Bayesian statistical approach that quantifies the spatial association between training points or known porphyry copper gold mineral occurrences and a set of predictive maps. So for example, distance to felsic intrusion or fault density or stream sediment copper anomalies. And it's basically looking at whether a deposit is present or absent, given the presence or absence of a predictive map pattern. So presence of a felsic intrusion or absence of a felsic intrusion. And the statistics take into consideration the amount of area covered by the predictive map patterns, and that can become quite important in terms of trying to reduce our exploration search space. Now, weights of evidence assumes conditional independence, so that basically the inputs that go into the final weights of evidence mineral potential map are supposed to be statistically independent of each other. However, given that we use a mineral systems-based approach for mineral potential mapping, they're rarely, if ever, actually independent of each other because the mineral systems processes are all interact with each other. So we try to minimise conditional independence by limiting the number of input maps that go into our final model so that we are not duplicating map patterns too much. So the input maps for the final model, they need to be statistically valid. They need to be geologically meaningful in terms of the mineral system being modelled, so no ridiculously huge buffers on things. And they also need to be practically useful in terms of helping us to reduce our exploration search space. So if a predictive map pattern covers 90% of our study area, are you better off just throwing a dart at the map? And so you can see in this table here, the different data types, how they relate to the mineral system and the key predictive variables for the porphyry copper gold model based on the weights of evidence statistics. So looking at the porphyry copper gold mineral potential using the weights of evidence technique, these are the 9 maps that were selected to go into our final model. The variable IDs are the various different thresholds that were selected based on the weights of evidence statistics, and the number of training points that were captured. The C value is the contrast, which is a measure of the correlation between the training points and our predictive maps. And the STUD-C is the studentized contrast value, which is a measure of confidence in our correlation. So you can see the number of maps that were made, how many were statistically valid, and how many actually produced a good correlation. So the prospective area came up as about 15% of the Macquarie Arc study area. The highly prospective area, about 0.1%. 13 of the 14 training points were located in the prospective area, with the exception of Kaiser, which came up in an unprospective area. And the efficiency of classification, which is basically how well did it predict a separate set of validation porphyry copper gold occurrences, about 91%. Now, this became a personal bugbear of mine because unfortunately we were wrapping up this project just as Alkane announced their huge Boda discovery. And so Kaiser coming up as unprospective was a bit of an issue. So basically looking at what we could do to try and improve the mineral potential mapping to try and predict Kaiser or Boda. So looking at zooming in to a bit more detail in this initial weights of evidence mineral potential mapping. So obviously the most highly prospective area coming up around Cadia and Cowell, no real surprises there. North Parkes came up as prospective, but only weakly prospective, and that's basically the lack of mapped faults in the area, as well as the deposit geometry, which is really hard to find in the regional scale data sets. And as I was saying, Kaiser being located in an unprospective area. Which is basically, it's not that it's unprospective, it was just that at the time the weights of evidence modelling was done, there was an absence of mapped intrusions and structures in the area. But as I was saying, they have now been found, they've now been mapped, and they are being integrated into the Geological Survey's Seamless Geology database. But when we did this modelling, that wasn't actually available to us. So it was basically looking at could we find Kaiser using these maps, the same data, but using a different mineral potential mapping technique. So you can see here, Kaiser being located up here and coming up in an perspective of the blue area. So going from weights of evidence to random forests, could we find Kaiser using a different approach without having to wait for the Seamless Geology database to get updated? And what was the best approach to use for defining the input data for the random forest model? And so, yeah, using the same maps that were used in the weights of evidence project in 2019, we just reanalyzed the same maps using the random forest technique. So random forests are a decision tree algorithm where the aim is to decide whether a deposit is present or absent, given the presence or absence of a particular map feature or characteristic of that feature. So the way we've set it up is we use a set of known deposit locations, so the same training data that we used in the weights of evidence model, as well as a set of probable non-deposit locations to train the model. So basically what it does, it goes through and picks out a random subset of predictive maps from the total number of predictive maps, and basically tries to decide whether a deposit is present or absent, given the presence or absence of the particular feature in each of those maps. And then it aggregates those votes together to reclassify the entire set of predictive maps into the required number of target classes, which in this case we have 2 target classes, which is prospective and unprospective, or deposit and not deposit. Now, random forest isn't constrained by the same statistical violation of conditional independence that the weights of evidence modelling has, which means we're able to more effectively utilise all of the available data rather than just a small subset. So we can put hundreds of maps into these models rather than just 9 or 10. So the different random forest models that were run, one was just using the same subset of 9 maps that went into the weights of evidence model. One, the 164 map model, was using all of the statistically valid and geologically meaningful binary maps that had the thresholds determined using the weights of evidence. A 197 map model, which used all of the maps that had no favourability criteria applied. So no thresholds determined, they hadn't been reclassified in any way using the weights of evidence statistics. And then fourth model, just to look at the effect of weighting our training data. So using the same 9 input maps as the weights of evidence model, but having 3 different sets of training data, 3 different classes of training data. So the same training points that went into the weights of evidence model, a separate subset of training points which were ranked slightly lower, and then also our non-deposit training data. So the implementation parameters for those who are interested, we looked at the out-of-bag errors through trial and error and basically tried to come up with an optimal number of trees to include in the forest, as well as the tree depth, just trial and error. And we were defining our non-deposit locations by putting a minimum of 1 kilometre from the nearest Ordovician Silurian magmatic unit and ensuring that there was a minimum 100 metres spacing between the points. All of the maps were made in ArcGIS, but the random forest itself was implemented using R. I did try to do it using ArcGIS, but I consistently crashed it due to the size of the input database, but R seemed to work. So the variable importance, all of the random forest models, we looked at the variable importance rankings for each of the models during the training, and all of the different random forest models highlighted the importance of geochemistry and magma fertility predictors for the system. No surprises at all, basically confirming existing ideas, looking at oxidized and potassium-rich magmatic units, copper-gold geochemical anomalies, and association with skarn epithermal mineral occurrences. Slightly unexpected was that some of the more generic magma fertility parameters, just looking at the Ordovician Silurian intrusions more generally and the oceanic high potassium volcanic units, they did rank relatively poorly in all of the random forest models. Didn't affect the output mineral potential maps, but what we found was that the more specific magma fertility maps based on the whole rock geochemistry ratios that are the proxies for the magma fertility, they ranked a lot higher in terms of their variable importance. So looking briefly at the results, so we have our weights of evidence model covered the prospective area 15% of our Macquarie Arc study area, finding 13 of our 14 training points and a 91% accuracy for predicting our validation training points. The 9-map binary model, you can see here, it covers about 23.5% of the Macquarie Arc study area, finds all of our training points in the prospective area, and has an accuracy of 93.5% for our training data. Just zooming in, you can see here, Kaiser's coming up as prospective, which is great. The 164 map model, there's a lot less prospective area in this model, but it does find all 14 of our training points in the prospective area and has an 88% accuracy for the validation training points. And then again, zooming in, we can see Kaiser again coming up as being prospective, which is great. The 197 map model is about 48% prospective area, so almost half of the Macquarie Arc is coming up as prospective, does find all of our training points, and a 97% accuracy of prediction for the validation points. And then for our, again, zooming in, you can see here, that's about half the Macquarie Arc is coming up as prospective. And then for our weighted training point model, so where we've got the same 14 training points as the weights of evidence model being ranked highly, and then a separate subset of porphyry copper gold occurrences ranked slightly lower, and our non-deposit training points as well. So it's finding all of the training points in both the prospective and highly prospective area. The highly prospective area, so the area for our more highly ranked training points is about 12%, but the sort of broader prospective area is about 40%. Has an overall accuracy of prediction of 97.5% for the validation points. And again, zooming in, you can see the yellow here is quite a large area, but the highly prospective area is a lot more narrowly defined. So comparison of the results, you can see here the amount of prospective area or highly prospective area coming up in the 4 different random forest models. All 4 of the models found Kaiser, which the weights of evidence method failed to predict. So that was good because that was the ultimate aim of the study from my perspective. But all the models also map discrete areas of prospectivity away from the known deposits and occurrences used as the training data. So they might represent exploration targets. The 197 map model is basically just mapping the Benambaran cycle magmatic units. So it's clearly demonstrating their importance, but it's essentially useless for exploration targeting because it's not helping us to reduce our exploration search space enough for it to be meaningful to define targets from. The model with the 9 maps, but the weighted training data is useful, but it's only really useful when you're looking at the highly prospective area. Otherwise, it's quite similar to the 197 map model in that the prospective area is too broad to really be useful for exploration targeting. So insights into the modelling. We achieved the aim of the study. So we could find Kaiser using the random forest technique, which was fantastic because I was saying that was what initially triggered this work being done. But we did find that the most robust results were achieved when the binary classified maps were used. So basically, they'd had thresholds reviewed by an expert to ensure that they made geological sense in the context of the porphyry copper gold mineral system, but also that the thresholds helped us to reduce our exploration search space. So using the non-thresholded maps that didn't have the favourability criteria applied might not be geologically meaningful, and they might not help to reduce the exploration search space, which really got highlighted in that 197 map model, in that it was suggesting that the Benambaran cycle magmatic units were important, but it wasn't actually producing a mineral potential map that was useful for exploration targeting. So the thresholds in this study were defined by the weights of evidence statistics, but they could be based on expert knowledge or other statistics of your preference. And we think that using this approach where we define the thresholds prior to going into the random forest seemed to work the best to ensure that we got geologically meaningful and practically useful results. Ranking or weighting of the training data does appear to be useful, but you need to have a reasonable number of known occurrences related to the mineral system available that actually allows you to do this, so you can rank the different classes of your training points, but also have enough occurrences left over to validate your model at the end. But this does allow for more effective targeting of the larger deposits because you can rank those deposits more highly when you are classifying your training data. So this has all been published now, and so if you're interested in any further details in the random forests, please just go and download it and have a look. Now, the conference organisers have asked us to include a diversity slide, so this is my diversity slide. So Kennex is a New Zealand-based company, and out of our 9 New Zealand-based staff, 6 are women, and we do have a female CEO, so I think we're doing pretty well in that regard for people who are working in the exploration industry. And we also have 5 people from overseas working in the team, so me, Aussie, we have someone from the UK, someone from Denmark, an Italian and a South African. But also in terms of working with traditional knowledge. We're actually working with local Maori iwi groups to help them make better land use decisions by integrating their traditional knowledge of the land using modern spatial data analysis. So this is something that we're really into and hoping to do more of in the future. And you can see here, this is Kennex working from home during New Zealand's lockdown earlier in the year. Thank you.